Welcome to the Personal Injury Law Show. This is a show that talks about everything current in the law and dealing with personal injuries. My name's Toby Carbone, personal injury lawyer, 30 years experience. With me tonight I've got John Karantzis, an accredited specialist in workers' compensation. Good evening, John.
Hi, Tony. Hi, viewers.
And Don Maffia, the TAC partner in the law firm. Good evening, Don.
Good evening, Tony. Good evening, viewers.
Viewers, tonight we've got a must-see episode with the Parliamentary leader of the State Greens Party. So stay tuned for that.
However, Tony, before we get to that, what's in the news?
Geez, John, there's been a lot of stories in the news. The first one that I want to talk about is this: experts attack the shock therapy law they're administering to young under 18-year-olds.
Very serious, Tony. Very serious. Children with psychological and psychiatric issues being given electric shock therapy.
John, it's kids as young as 12 or younger, I think,
Yes.
that can be exposed to this electric shock therapy. Despite the World Health Organization saying that you should not use that type of therapy, our government has introduced a bill to allow shock therapy to be used on these kids.
And it's been passed.
I find it extraordinary because it's a pretty conservative sort of a government when it comes to medicine and treatments, don't you think?
Yeah, Tony, look, at the same time, if someone has such psychological and psychiatric problems that nothing else has helped, maybe that's the only way to literally reboot this person.
I don't really understand enough about it, but what exactly they do, they just...
What you've seen in the movies, Tony, where they're literally shocking the patient.
But it could actually, there's some tests and research going on that say it actually could cause brain damage and memory loss. So
I can see that happening, Donna. I mean, if you're
with-
getting electricity put through your brain, and geez, I
Look,
think
at the
it's
same
harsh.
time, Tony, I had a client not long ago where she was severely psychiatrically disturbed. She telephoned me saying, "John, I'm going in to have electric shock therapy."
And what did
I
you
said
say?
to her straight out, "Are you sure you want to do this? It's pretty radical." She goes, "John, I can't handle this anymore. I'm all over the place, and I'll give you a ring in a few months' time."
And did she
go-
ring after that?
Tony, I didn't hear from her for about 6 months.
We should do a total episode on this, don't you think, Don? I mean, it's just too contentious.
Look,
and
I think it is, and you're always going to have well, look, it may work in some scenarios, may not work, but I just think giving it to kids, that's just ludicrous.
Do you know what I want to talk about now? Manus Island.
Oh, yes.
This G4S, I find it extraordinary what's going down. Investigating the death of that Iraqi refugee,
Yes.
the young 23-year-old.
Yes.
There's been expats talk about what the company's told them not to do, and it's told them not to cooperate and not to keep records.
That's the problem, Tony. The government and the investigators in Papua New Guinea, they want to investigate what's gone on in this facility, but there's no cooperation. That's a problem.
Don, there's no records.
Well, they're just not speaking to, not helping the investigation, which I would have thought, given the situation that they're in, that it should be mandatory.
And G4S and the Commonwealth are just opening themselves up
To a can of worms.
Well, for litigation, Tony, because they are required to provide every detainee with a safe environment.
Yeah, but what really astounds me is there's no proper documentation of these incidents.
Now, John, what do you think about this? G4S has handed over the security operations to Wilson Security, so they're no longer responsible for Manus
No,
Island.
you can't. The government can't even it's a non-delegable duty job.
Exactly. And,
But it's just, what do you read into them giving it to someone else and no longer having essentially their contract?
well, that says a lot, doesn't it?
We can't comment.
All right.
And I'd rather not comment about that. But now Wilson Security, well, they are now liable and responsible for the facility.
Well, I think all of them are. The government can't contract out of its
Exactly.
obligations.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean? So you got that non-delegable duty. You
Yes.
got G4S. You got Wilson. You got more parties to sue, I would have thought.
Oh, yes.
Anyway, look, let's go on to this. Informer X The thing that disturbs me about this issue of the informer...
Lawyer X, Tony.
You're not supposed to be disclosing personal confidential information of your clients,
It's
John.
privileged information. Any information that a client gives a lawyer is privileged.
And what's the exception, Don?
Tony, the exception to privilege is if there's an emergency occurs involving the sudden and unexpected threat of harm or death to somebody.
So in other
That's
words,
acceptable.
if a client comes to you as a lawyer and says, I'm going to go and shoot my next door neighbour, and you genuinely believe he's going to do it, you have to report it to the authorities.
Exactly, that's an exception. However, when your client, as a lawyer, tells you that, oh, by the way, I've been dealing in some cocaine trade and a few other matters, well, that's all privileged, isn't it, Tony?
The problem with that too, John, is that if he then wants you to defend it, you can't.
No, of course
you can't
not.
defend it. You've
Of course
got
not.
to encourage him to plead guilty or
Exactly.
send him away.
Well, a lawyer has a duty to the court. A lawyer cannot mislead the court.
No.
It's a duty of honesty, and it's a very high threshold, and that's a good thing.
Well, let me put it to you this way, viewers. If by any chance they discover who this lawyer X is, and they can prove that he's disclosing personal and confidential information of clients, that lawyer will not be practicing in Australia because they will be stripped.
Exactly. It could be he or it could be a she, Tony.
We don't know who it is.
Yeah.
And I think it should stay that way.
Well, especially for that lawyer's sake.
In New South Wales, they had some really horrific changes to their work cover laws under Bob Carr. But what did they do last year, John? Some of the recent changes.
The thresholds have been tightened. Workers have lost rights. Their rights have been minimised, Tony. And in one particular example, Tony, a amputated foot will not reach the threshold for a serious injury.
What, you lose a leg and that's not serious?
And that's not serious. In New South Wales, we're talking about.
So that means a person who's lost a foot cannot access compensation in terms of your...
Lump sum compensation will be almost destroyed in New South Wales for someone that has lost their foot.
That's bizarre. That is absolutely outrageous.
That's outrageous, and I'm surprised the unions have allowed this to occur.
I just can't. I'm speechless.
Yeah.
Yeah. It just goes to show that the government is so out of whack, particularly New South Wales, with community values. I mean,
When do you get compensation in those circumstances?
Oh, it's very limited, Tony. There might be some weekly payments and medical expenses, but lump sum entitlement is virtually destroyed.
Viewers, give us your comments, Twitter and Facebook on this one. This is extraordinary, absolutely. Genes. They say that imports from overseas are causing cancer to kids. Excessive use of dyes.
Tony, it looks like the restrictions and controls aren't there.
Yeah, it's a problem, isn't it?
And it's affecting the young, isn't it, Tony?
Exactly. John, thanks for coming on board. We've got
Thank
Greg
you.
Barber after the break, viewers, so please stay tuned. Viewers, welcome back to the show. Today we're very fortunate to have Greg Barber, the leader of the Greens in State Parliament. Join us. Good evening, Greg.
Hey, thanks for having me.
And we're going to be talking about a number of public safety issues that Greg's party are very interested in. And the first one, Greg, is in relation to bikes and the bike lane. Tell us a bit about your position on this.
Well, as you know, we're getting a lot of accidents in Melbourne now. People opening their car door in front of a cyclist. And people need to understand that when you open your car door, you are actually responsible if you cause a hazard to a cyclist or another vehicle.
Don, the incidence of car doorings has increased significantly, correct?
that's correct.
And because of that, the legislation, Transport Accident Act, was amended to pick up someone opening a door.
So it was amended a while ago, so it's not a recent phenomenon happening with these car dooring. And essentially, if you have an accident, a cyclist is injured as a result of a door opening, they're entitled to recover benefits from the Transport Accident Act.
And it's
So-
a common law claim.
And it'll be obviously a common law claim as well.
Greg, your party's trying to introduce a criminal penalty component to the whole thing. Is that correct?
There's already an infringement notice. You can be fined for doing that. But, the laws that cover vulnerable road users, and we're not just talking cyclists, but pedestrians, council road workers, anybody who's vulnerable but they're out on the road, I don't think are being enforced strongly enough. And so people aren't getting the message. Fling your car door open, knock someone over, and the first thought that comes to the driver or passenger's mind is, oh, that must have been their fault. Yep. So people need to learn a bit more about the law, and they need to know they have a special responsibility to vulnerable road users when they're out there driving as motorists.
So what would you advocate as the proper punishment for someone that just swings the door open?
Well, we wanted that fine to be increased to put it in line with other dangerous driving offences, such as driving past the open doors of a tram or running a stoplight. And after some lobbying from cyclists and a parliamentary inquiry, the government did go ahead and do that.
Don, is the road suitable for cars and bikes?
I think the roads were designed without having regard to cyclists. You look at Melbourne CBD, you have these, now there's confusion, and Greg, I think there's confusion as to what is a bike lane, what's on a bike lane. But essentially you've got these little lanes down on the left-hand side of the roadways, and it's cut down the amount of space for drivers. Therefore, a lot more traffic, a lot more cyclists, a lot more pedestrians on the road. I don't think Melbourne's suited for it, but it is something that we have to deal with.
Greg, in years to come, I'd anticipate that the number of road users that are cyclists is going to probably triple. Is that a fair estimate?
Absolutely. And look, 80% of those cyclists are also motorists. They have driver's licences. Okay. But I think when 80% of motorists are also cyclists, people will be a lot better at learning how to share the road and get on together.
Greg, without getting your nose out of joint, my only beef is you can't identify a cyclist. Don't you think it's appropriate that they have some sort of a number plate, albeit it doesn't have to be a number plate as we know in the context of a car? Some identification plate.
Well, I think it would be enormously time-consuming and expensive to set up such a system and run it. And the only thing it would be good for is detecting people when they run red lights. That's a problem, of course, but really we just need better enforcement of the law. But right now, in relation to bikes and motorists, there's not even a great understanding of the law, what those road rules are and what they cover. And that's why you get these altercations going on.
Some time ago, I got out of a car and I'd been out of a car for a few seconds and a cyclist slammed into me. It took me a while to get to my senses. He took off. Assuming I was seriously injured, then what?
Well, unless you identified him, Tony, unless you had any assets, assume it is a he, there's not much else you could do.
And another person got hit by a cyclist and damaged his shoulder very, very badly, seriously injured. Couldn't identify the cyclist. That's why I'm saying, Greg, I think some sort of identification plate can't hurt.
Well, it's going to be an extraordinarily difficult system to set up and administer. And remember, we're talking about a bicycle that might just be sitting in the back shed. You take it out. It's hardly. It has to follow all of the road rules as a vehicle, but to register it as a vehicle is going to create problems.
And Greg, part of the amendments you made to legislation was to increase the amount of fines. But you also sought, which didn't get passed, but you also sought that the driver loses demerit points, even if they weren't the ones opening the door. That wasn't passed. What's the thought behind that? Is that more punishing the driver because they should make sure that any pedestrians or passengers in the car should be aware of when they get out and what to do?
Well, the Victoria Police supported that demerit point issue. Now, a fine, some people just cop it and pay it, but with demerit points, they're worried about losing their licence. So a lot of these serious offences, the ones that could lead to loss of life or serious injury, and we have seen that with dooring, they need to be treated seriously, and that's why the police agreed that demerit points as well as fines should be included.
Is there enough being done in terms of public education between the interaction of drivers and cyclists, Greg?
No, not enough. And after the tragic case of James Cross, who was knocked off his bike by a door but then fell under a truck, the coroner's inquiry looked at that. She said better infrastructure for cyclists, but also an education campaign. And I don't think the government's actually delivered that part of the coroner's finding yet.
My concern is there's still a lot of angst between drivers and cyclists, and unless there is training and education, that's going to continue into the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And with dooring, I think the simplest thing would be an education campaign, a TAC style approach. But since it's mostly in a city, they could perhaps do it in the inner city area on car parking signs where it says 2 hours, 3 hours or whatever.
Yes.
Put up a sign saying, watch out for cyclists when you're getting in and out of your car.
Exactly. Don, we better keep moving because there's a few other issues I want to discuss. Tell us a bit about Hazelwood.
Well, Hazelwood's a power plant in the Latrobe Valley, situated near a few kilometres away from Morwell, the city of Morwell. And they have a lot of open cut mines, which is all coal, where they source all the coal to put it to source the power, to make the power. And there was a fire deliberately lit in February of this year that I believe is still going, Greg. I think they haven't extinguished it fully.
They say it stopped.
They say it's under control. It's still, I think it's still going, but it's under control. And it pretty much, anyone who's aware of Latrobe Valley, it's a valley, so the whole valley was just smoked out with toxic fumes, and that was and still is, I believe, still going.
Greg, it affects about 80,000 people, is that correct, your understanding?
Well, there's 13,000 people right there in Morwell, and when I visited, what you could actually see was the smoke coming out of the open cut like a waterfall in reverse, straight across the Princes Highway, 6 lanes, and into the backyards of people's houses right there. That's how dramatic it was, and it was absolutely choking people for weeks at a time.
So it's a cocktail, a soup cocktail.
Well, we know that even ordinary wood smoke is carcinogenic, and these people were suffering from it for weeks and weeks at a time. We know from other studies, in fact, that the level of heart attacks will jump immediately in any city or town that even suffers smoke for a day or two.
Viewers, we've got to go to a sponsors break. Stay tuned. After the break, we'll come back to some of these hard-hitting stories. Viewers, welcome back to the show. We're very fortunate tonight to have Greg Barber, the leader of the Greens in the State Parliament. Greg, Hazelwood, very touchy subject. What do you think the government should have done when we had this problem?
Well, we said very early on in the piece that they should be making evacuation available to the most vulnerable people. I mean, that's 13,000 right there in Morwell, but they're people who've already got some of the highest burden of disease, so vulnerable to heart conditions, lung conditions, and the very young and the very old. These are the first people you would move out of that smoky environment, but it was weeks and weeks and weeks before the government finally started saying, yes, you should get out, and here's a bit of assistance if you can't get yourself out.
Don, do you believe that there could be potential claims in the future because of what's happened in Hazelwood?
Dane, there is some literature to suggest that it could be probable that in these scenarios, people exposed to this amount of fumes could attract or could cause cancerous conditions. In Morwell, unfortunately, Latrobe Valley has been plagued for many, many years by the asbestos-related diseases. So this is just another wave. It looks like it might be another wave of diseases coming along.
Can I just say on that, by the way, the economic losses, the nuisance and the distress that was caused over those many weeks for people in that area, I think is already grounds for compensation.
Okay.
But we've now got an inquiry set up, which is a Royal Commission in all but name, that's going to get to the bottom, we hope, of the causes of the disaster and also the impact that it's had on people.
And it could eventually lead to a class action, I'd imagine, possibly.
Well, that's your area of expertise. I just make the laws.
Because we're on this subject of Hazelwood and everything that the people have been exposed to, let's get on to this presumptive legislation for firefighters. It's something that we've done on this show a few times. Tell us what your view of it is and what your party's doing.
Well, we know from studies around the world that firefighters as a population get certain types of cancers much more often than the population at large. And that's because they're exposed to a toxic soup of chemicals every time they go to a fire. So our view is that we should put the onus on the government to disprove the cancer was connected to the fire, because it's so hard for a firefighter to prove that a particular exposure at a particular fire caused their cancer.
But
I think if we had that, it would save both the government and, of course, the affected firefighters a lot of money, because we'd avoid legal trials, and also we'd get the medical treatment and certainty better, quicker, and they'd be able to possibly get back to work.
Don, if you had to run one of these trials to connect your injury, that is your cancer, to firefighting, what are we talking in terms of cost? You might have to get experts from overseas.
It'll be a case of experts, Tony. There'll be no doubt some experts saying there is a causative link between the exposure and the cancer, and there may be a different school that thinks not. So you're talking about a trial of experts, and that could go on for weeks and weeks, and the amount of money that you'll spend on these experts is astronomical.
And even if you win it, it'll go on appeal, won't it?
Well, you would think so.
And then it could finish up in a high court.
That's right. I mean, the problem with these cases is causation.
Yep.
So the presumptive legislation would mean all you have to show is that you worked as a firefighter.
Greg,
the rest follows.
You're trying to get the parliamentary figures as to the cost of introducing this legislation. Where are you at with that?
So we've brought our bill into the Parliament a number of times to enact this. And by the way, other states of Australia, including Liberal states, have already done it. The government is balking at the cost, but we want to get their figures, their estimates out, because we think we can show that actually overall it will be a lower cost to simply look after these people properly and reduce the contestation that goes with it.
Do you know what the figures are roughly?
Well, they're saying millions, of course, but their figures are based on a whole range of assumptions about the occurrence of these cancers, the comparison to the population and all the rest of it. And that should actually be put out in the open.
And the federal government's got presumptive legislation?
For a limited number of firefighters who work in airports and the rest of it.
Okay.
But West Australia, South Australia and Tassie are all moving pretty fast in this direction.
Okay. Let's talk about climate health. What's your view about that?
It's acknowledged that the effects of climate change are already here with us, and that's affecting people in their day-to-day lives. We know that the heat waves that Melbourne's experienced recently and as far back as 2009 have actually tragically led to more deaths than bushfires, and we need to take some serious steps to address that.
It's a very touchy subject, climate change and climate health, because the majority of the population and the world don't understand it. Is that correct?
Well, that's right, and it's a topic that's not going to go away. It's got to be more and more awareness of climate change. And Tony, I think the world today don't have a real appreciation of the effects of such climate change on our day-to-day living.
I think there's an indifference there, Greg, that it's not our problem. We'll let the future generations worry about it. Is that your view?
Well, I can tell you that when the bushfires led to a $20 million Royal Commission, but when it came to the heat wave that occurred just prior to the 2009 fires, where more people died, according to the Chief Medical Officer, there's been very little exposure of that. And I was told by one health bureaucrat, well, Mr. Barber, this was just a lot of people who all died at one time, but they were going to die anyway. Therefore, we're not particularly worried about it. And I found that to be a startling kind of attitude.
Don, when we had that heat wave recently, we had the union chief on the show last week.
Yes.
He said they could not cope with they were inundated with calls, and a lot of people died. We don't know what the figures are yet.
That's right. It puts a pressure on the whole state. I mean, you look at the emergency services that have to attend to it, not the amount of deaths involved. The figures that are coming out from this climate change and the effects it's had on the day-to-day living of people far outweigh any single events that have occurred over the last, how far, Greg, decade or so or more.
Greg, we've got to get you back because the time flies, as you well know. How would you like to finish off, apart from voting for you?
Oh, well, that goes without saying, and there is an election
Yes.
later on this year, and I'd love to be back before then.
Yes.
But look, these are things which we can work together as a community to solve. Governments, of course, tend to push liability away, and as these issues get bigger and bigger and bigger, I think people need to judge for themselves whether the government's keeping up with the emerging sort of rate of change.
Yes. I think funding's always been a massive issue. Don, thanks for coming on board. Greg, thanks for having you on board. Get you back in the future.
No worries.
Viewers, thanks for watching. We've discussed some very topical issues. Go to Facebook and Twitter. Stay tuned for future episodes and always remember to stay safe.